Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
I still remember the exact sound of his voice that night, steady and sharp in a way that cut through the clinking of forks and the low hum of family chatter, as if he wanted every single person at that table to carry his words home with them and whisper them to others later. It was Christmas Eve, the night everyone pretends to set their differences aside, when families who fight all year long suddenly smile for the sake of a holiday photo. Yet my father couldn't resist leaning back in his chair, smirking like he was about to deliver a punchline and declaring that I was nothing but a burden. He didn't even raise his tone. It was calm, deliberate, the kind of sentence you don't need to repeat because once is enough to burn itself into memory. For a moment the entire room went quiet. Even the sound of my younger cousins snickering over something on their phones died out, and every pair of eyes flicked between him and me like people waiting to see if a fire would spread or if someone would smother it with a napkin. I wanted to fire back instantly, to ask him how many burdens had spent years putting money into a house that wasn't even theirs, how many burdens had bailed their parents out when the roof started leaking or when the furnace went out. How many burdens had co-signed the very loan that kept a roof over everyone's head when the bank was ready to laugh them out the door, but the words caught in my throat. Not because I didn't have them, but because the weight of the silence around me pressed harder than his insult. My mother lowered her gaze to her plate, stabbing her fork into the green beans as if she could escape into the steam rising from her plate. My sister gave me the kind of pity smile that's worse than outright laughter, the one that says, "Yeah, that was cruel, but I'm not going to risk myself defending you." My brother cleared his throat and reached for the gravy like he hadn't heard a thing. That was the part that stung more than his sentence, not the insult itself, but the way. The family let it hang in the air unchallenged, as if the verdict had been passed and now it was time to move on. So I sat there, holding my fork in one hand and my composure in the other, and I forced myself to chew slowly, to breathe evenly, to keep my face from betraying the storm inside me. Because while everyone else thought I was swallowing humiliation, what I was actually swallowing was the urge to ruin the night right then and there. I already knew something they didn't know, something I had quietly arranged in the weeks leading up to Christmas when I got tired of being the safety net that never got a thank you, the last resort they leaned on but never respected. I had made one phone call, signed one form, and set in motion a shift they wouldn't see coming until it was too late. And as his words rolled around the table like toxic smoke, all I could think was how sweet it would feel to finally watch it choke him. The dinner dragged on, people pretending to laugh at jokes, kids sneaking candy canes from the tree, and my father pouring himself another glass of wine as if he hadn't just lit a match in the middle of the room. I barely tasted a single bite of food. Instead, I kept thinking about the moment that was coming, the one I had been saving in my pocket like a secret weapon, the one that would prove I was never a burden. I was the pillar they stood on without even realizing it. I let him gloat, let him enjoy his holiday toast, let him carry on with the smug belief that his words had finally pushed me into my corner for good. But corners are dangerous places because once you're there long enough, you start planning how to get out, and when you do, you don't come out quietly. That night, while everyone else exchanged gifts and laughed like his sentence had evaporated into the Christmas lights, I excused myself early, went upstairs, and stared at the half-packed suitcase I had hidden under my bed. My hands itched to finish the job right then, to slam it shut and roll it down the stairs so they could see exactly how far a so-called burden could walk on her own, but I held back. Timing mattered. Words like his demanded a response so sharp it left no room for arguments, and I wasn't going to waste it on a heated comeback at dinner. I wanted the silence to stretch, the smugness to settle, the belief that I had accepted my place to root itself firmly in his mind. Because only then would the shock of what I had done hit with full force. So I zipped the suitcase halfway and sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the muffled laughter downstairs, and I told myself that this was the last time I would ever play the quiet daughter who absorbs the blows. That insult was not just another jab, it was the trigger. That was the night I decided my silence had an expiration date. People like to assume that the word family automatically means fairness, that help is offered in both directions, and that respect is the common language in the house. Yet the story behind that Christmas Eve insult started years earlier when my father's credit was wobbling and his temper was steady, when the bank manager glanced at his file and shook her head in that polite way that says absolutely not. And when my mother looked at me with that pleading expression I knew too well, the one that had followed me since high school field trips and college deposits and every emergency between. So I signed on the dotted line because I was told this was temporary, because I was told it was just to get them approved, because I was told we were in it together and that gratitude would be obvious even if it was never spoken out loud. I kept a neat folder with the statements and the interest breakdowns and the notices that arrive when someone forgets a payment, and I could tell you the maturity date and the escrow balance without checking the portal, not because I am a natural accountant, but because I had to be, because every time my father promised he would handle it and then snapped about how complicated banks make things, I was the one who logged in at midnight and moved money around to keep the lights on and the late fees away. He called me a burden, but when the furnace died in the middle of winter and the repair guy wanted half up front, my debit card carried more weight than any speech about responsibility. And when the roof decided it was tired of doing its job and started flirting with the idea of letting water visit the living room, I cut a check so fast I barely processed that the money came from the fund I had been building for a certification I wanted, the one that would have pushed my salary up and opened doors to the kind of independence they said they admired in other people's children, but somehow resented when it lived under their own roof. It was always the same rhythm. A phone call from my mother that started soft and ended shaky, a promise from my father that sounded brave and dissolved by morning, a little family speech about how we take care of our own. And then me stepping in because the mortgage company does not accept pride as a payment method. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was investing in stability and that stability would eventually let me step back. Yet year after year the thanks never came. The expectations grew roots. And my sister flourished in the warm glow of being the favorite who made everyone proud while never being asked to lift the heavy things. You want to know the part that finally started to turn the gears in my head long before the holiday insult, the part one kept swallowing because it was easier to pretend I was fine than to admit I was angry. It was the afternoon I asked to pause the house help for a month because I had a medical bill that insurance did not cover and I was already stretched thin. And my father rolled his eyes like I had just asked him to sell the car and said that grown adults do not beg for special treatment, as if I had not been the special treatment wrapped around his mortgage for years, as if my boundaries were an inconvenience rather than the first healthy decision I had made in a long time. That was when I started writing down dates and amounts and promises in a quiet little spreadsheet, not to shame anyone but to remind myself I was not imagining things, and the truth was ugly on paper. A list of transfers and auto drafts from my account that had been labeled temporary and somehow turned permanent. A history of utilities and insurance premiums and emergency repairs that I covered, because it was easier than arguing with a man who equates volume with authority. After the insult, when I went upstairs and stared at the half-packed suitcase, I also pulled out that folder and that spreadsheet and I looked at them the way you look at a map when you finally decide to leave a town that never treated you kindly. And I realized that my revenge did not need to be loud to be effective. It just needed to be clear and final and anchored in the same systems they leaned on me to navigate. So I sat at my desk, opened the mortgage portal I knew better than my father did, and I canceled the automatic payment that had been silently drawing from my account on the first of every month. A quiet click that felt like an earthquake under my own feet. And then I logged into the utility accounts that had my card saved as the default hero and I removed it, one by one, replacing my presence with a line of dashes and a reminder that they now had to enter their own information, and finally I called my bank and asked for a hard lock on outgoing transfers to any pays that were not already on my personal list, which meant that the sneaky late-night moves I had used to save them were no longer possible even if I caved later. It was not the final blow. Not the move that would show up in a headline if our life were news, but it was the first clean cut in a net that had been wrapped around me for years, and it felt so good I almost laughed. Downstairs, the laughter kept floating up the stairs, thick and familiar, as if the night had returned to normal and my father's sentence had dissolved into the holiday air. Yet I sat with my small hurricane of confirmations and email receipts, knowing that by the time the calendar flipped into a new month, the house would start to feel the absence of the daughter they called a burden, and that this time I would not rush in to fix anything. They believed I would always play along. They believed I would always be available. They believed I would apologize and keep paying because that is what I had always done. And as I closed the laptop and slid the folder back into my bag, I knew with a certainty that steadied my hands that their belief was about to meet reality. They thought I would keep playing along. They thought wrong. The morning after that dinner, I woke up with the kind of clarity that does not shout but holds your head steady and keeps your hands from shaking. Because I had finally stopped arguing with the part of me that kept insisting I owed this family a version of myself that bled quietly. So I made coffee I barely tasted, zipped the suitcase another few inches, folded the documents I had kept for years in a binder that had become a second spine, and drove to the credit union that services the mortgage, where the loan officer knew me by first name because I was the one who called about escrow adjustments and insurance confirmations and interest recalculations. And when I sat down in her office, I told her that I was ready to execute the release we had discussed on the phone weeks earlier when I first asked, in a very calm voice, what it would take to remove a co-borrower who had been carrying more than her share for far too long. She pulled up the file, glanced at the equity that had grown while I worked overtime and while the market did its generous dance, looked at the pension and disability income statements my parents had finally submitted after months of excuses, nodded at the reserve requirement that I had temporarily fronted from my savings to make the ratios behave, and said that the release of liability could be finalized that day if I signed the last page and left the rest to their processing team, which I did without theatrics because I did not need catharsis in a bank lobby. I needed a stamp and a date and a letter I could hold in my hand. There is something quietly electric about watching a system that you have used for years against yourself finally move in your favor. Something almost tender about the way a notary slides a form across a desk and asks you to sign in the box where your name has lived for so long, as if the ink itself were a pair of scissors cutting you free. And when she handed me the provisional release letter that spelled out, in simple lines, that I was no longer legally responsible for payments due after a certain effective date, and that all future notices would be directed solely to the remaining borrower, I folded it once, placed it in the binder, and felt my shoulders drop in a way they had not in years. I did not call anyone to announce it. I did not text my sister or my mother or the cousin who likes to deliver news like it is hot tea, because I wanted the revelation to arrive in the only room where it mattered, the house that had eaten my paychecks while calling me ungrateful. So I drove home and went upstairs and began the kind of packing that is both inventory and confession, deciding which books were mine, which dishes I had bought when theirs cracked, which bills in the drawer downstairs had my handwriting because I had been the one to pay them. My mother knocked and asked if I could run to the store for foil pans because she wanted to send leftovers to the neighbors and did not want to deal with scrubbing casserole dishes, and I told her I would not be able to, that I had errands of my own today. And she sighed the way people sigh when they want you to feel guilty without them having to say anything, then asked if everything was okay because I had been quiet since last night, and I said that everything was exactly as it needed to be, which was the truth even if she did not recognize it as such. My sister sent a cheerful message with a winking joke about fathers and their old-school moods, and I typed and erased 3 different replies before I settled on a single line that said I was busy and would talk later, because I did not want to spend one more minute translating my pain into something digestible for people who prefer their reality lightly seasoned. By late afternoon, the binder sat in my open bag next to the release letter and a printed confirmation from the utility companies showing that my cards had been removed, and I walked through the rooms touching only the things that were mine, repeating a promise under my breath that I would not backtrack this time, that I would not let a plea or a tantrum or a guilt-laced memory pull me back into the role of rescuer. When the front door opened and I heard my father's voice tumble into the hallway with the same authority he uses for stories that place him at the center of everyone's gratitude, I did not flinch. I only checked that the envelope was within reach and that the suitcase would close in a single motion, because I had already done the hard part, and now all that remained was to say the words out loud in the simplest possible way. I listened to him move through the kitchen, complaining about the price of groceries and the laziness of people who do not want to work, and I thought about the years I had spent working 2 jobs while he told anyone who would listen that I was still finding myself, and I felt a steadiness that told me I would not raise my voice, would not cry, would not ask for permission to be done. When he finally called my name from the bottom of the stairs as if he were summoning an employee who had missed a shift, I took one last look at the binder, ran my fingers over the embossed edge where my name used to sit next to his on the loan, and I walked toward the landing with the kind of resolve that builds when you have rehearsed the truth for so long that it no longer asks for approval, because I was ready to tell him exactly what I had done and exactly what it meant for him, and I knew. The moment the words left my mouth, the house we had all used like a stage would finally show who kept it standing. He called up the stairs with that tone he uses when he wants witnesses, the half-joking bark that says he expects me to come running because he is in the mood to perform, and I took my time walking down. Not to be dramatic, but because I wanted my heartbeat to match my decision. So when I stepped into the doorway and saw him leaning on the banister with his arms crossed like a foreman about to give a lecture on hard work to someone who has been carrying his bricks for years, I did not flinch. I did not swallow, and I did not ask for a Kinder version of last night. I just told him, very plainly and without raising my voice, that if I was nothing but a burden then today would be his lucky day. Because I had removed my name from the loan, and from this moment forward the house would stand on the shoulders of the people who claimed it with so much pride. He blinked once like the words were a foreign language, laughed in that tired way men laugh when they think you are bluffing, and told me that banks do not just let people walk away from obligations, and that I should stop trying to be clever and just apologize for making Christmas uncomfortable. But I was not trying to be clever, I was being final. So I set the envelope on the table between the keys and the holiday napkins and asked him to read the letter that carried the date and the signature and the notary stamp and the very simple sentence that said I was released from liability going forward. He did not pick it up right away, because that would have meant surrendering control of the scene he had planned, so he paced to the sink and back again and told me I was being cruel to my mother, that I was punishing a house that had fed me, that this was no way to treat family. And while he stacked accusations like poker chips, I kept my hands at my sides and let him run out of breath. Then I walked the letter to him like you hand a receipt to someone who insists they were overcharged, and I pointed, gently and without gloating, to the line that explained the effective date and the conditions they had met after the credit union reviewed the updated income and reserves. Conditions he had grumbled about for weeks and pretended were insults to his dignity, conditions I had quietly helped organize because I knew that if he qualified on his own, the door I needed would finally open. He read quickly, the way people read when they are hunting for a loophole that will let them keep their story. Then he looked at me and said this piece of paper could not possibly mean what it said it meant, and I said it meant exactly that, and that starting now the payment would be their responsibility alone, and that I had already removed my cards from the utilities and canceled the auto drafts that used to kick in when he forgot, which meant that the next due date would arrive like a grown-up problem and not like a message forwarded to me with a sigh. My mother came in with a dish towel and a face that begged for peace, asking if we could talk upstairs or after coffee or at least without raised voices, and I told her my voice was not raised and my decision was not a tantrum. It was a boundary that should have been respected years ago, and that I was not leaving them without options because the very letter in his hand confirmed they had the capacity to carry what they insisted was theirs, and that my leaving simply corrected a math problem, where I had been counted as both a person and a solution. My sister, from the doorway, tried a softer play, asking whether I really wanted to do this the day after Christmas, because it felt harsh and not very festive. And I said that the calendar was not the issue and that if the night before had been festive enough for a public humiliation, the morning after was certainly appropriate for clarity. And that if anyone wanted to discuss tone they could start by asking why I was labeled a burden while my name sat on the only document that kept this place from becoming a memory. He told me he would call a lawyer and that I would find out very quickly how wrong I was about what a release can and cannot do, and I said he should make whatever calls made him feel competent, but that he would hear the same words from anyone who understood loans. Because the bank had signed, the notary had stamped, and the file was already updated, and that the only thing left to decide was whether he preferred to set up his own auto-pay today or discover late fees the old-fashioned way. He asked how I could be so cold, and I said cold would have been pulling the plug in the middle of winter when the furnace repair still sat on my statement. While what I had done was the opposite of cold, because I had waited until the conditions were met, and the numbers worked, and the transfer of responsibility could not be spun into a crisis I would be blamed for fixing. I zipped the suitcase, slid the binder into my bag, and told him I would be gone by evening, that I was not slamming the door or erasing birthdays or blocking phone numbers. I was simply ending a job I never applied for and that no one ever paid me to do. And if he wanted to call that betrayal after calling me a burden, that was his right, but it would not change a single line in a single system, and it would not refill a single account that used to refill itself, because I could not stand to watch them fail. His face went pale in the way people go pale when control evaporates, and he set the letter down with a hand that was not as steady as he wanted it to be, and I told him there was one more thing he should know. That before the week ended 2 notices would land in his inbox reminding him to confirm the insurance and the tax escrow adjustments that I used to handle without announcement, and that if he ignored them the house would learn how fast consequences move when they are no longer cushioned, and as his phone buzzed on the counter with a new message and his eyes flicked to the subject line that read payment method removed, I reached for the handle of my suitcase and said I hoped he enjoyed the quiet while it lasted, because the next sound he heard would decide how this story ends. By the time evening settled into that heavy quiet that follows a house-sized argument, the kind where people walk softer because pride is bruised and excuses are still rehearsing on the tongue, I had already rolled my suitcase to the door, slid the binder into my bag with the release letter tucked where it could not be lost, and drafted the one email I knew I needed to send not for drama but for record, a clean message addressed to my parents with a copy to myself that attached the bank's confirmation, the utility removals, and a simple statement in plain words explaining that beginning with the next cycle they were solely responsible for payments and notices, that I would not be available to bridge gaps, and that all future communication about the house should go to the borrower listed on the account, which was not me anymore. And as I hovered over send, I heard the familiar shuffle of my father's step in the hallway followed by my mother's softer voice trying to shape this into a misunderstanding, and I realized that if I did not set the last terms right now I would be dragged back into the same loop by morning. So I hit send, put my phone on the table face down so I would not read the replies as they came in, and told my mother that I was going to a short-term rental I had lined up weeks ago under a name that was only mine, that the lease would carry me through the certification program I had finally enrolled in using the money that used to disappear into their repairs and late fees, and that I would still answer if she called about health or real emergencies, but that I would not discuss the mortgage, the insurance, the taxes, or any of the household logistics that had been treated like my unpaid job, because the job had ended and the resignation was effective immediately. My father asked if I felt like a winner now that I had proven a point, and I said I did not feel like a winner or a loser because this was not a game, it was the correction of a boundary that had been ignored for years. Though if he needed a scoreboard, he could consider the fact that I had also placed a freeze on my credit with every bureau and filed a written revocation of authorization with the servicer so that no one could add my name back or speak on my behalf without my consent, and that my phone would no longer be the number the bank called when the account fell behind, and that if the silence he was about to hear felt like punishment, it was actually the sound of me minding my business the way he always told me to when the conversation was about my needs. The first messages landed within minutes, my sister pleading for a pause because she did not want to watch him spiral, my brother insisting that family keeps things off paper and that sending emails was cruel, my mother asking if we could pray on it and talk after New Year because she hated starting a year with this kind of tension, and I answered each one with the same steady paragraph that thanked them for writing and repeated the new rule in a single breathable line, that I loved them but would not finance them, that I wished them stability, and that I would not debate a decision that had already been notarized, and when the calls started I let them ring, because I had already said everything that mattered. And because picking up would invite the familiar swirl of guilt and bargaining and character assassination that always ends with me carrying the bill. I packed the last drawer, placed my set of keys on the table next to the release letter, and added one more document that no one asked for but that I knew would change the way the story replayed in their minds, a calm invoice that itemized the major payments I had made in the past few years, not to demand repayment because I did not want their money anymore, but to remove the fog that helps people forget what it costs to be their safety net. And at the bottom I wrote a single line that said the balance due is not dollars but respect, and that respect would be measured going forward by how often they avoided using my name as a tool when bills arrived. Before I left, I walked my mother through the 2 notices that would show up in their inbox by the end of the week, the insurance confirmation and the tax escrow update that I used to click through on autopilot. And I told her how to complete them so she would not get penalized, not because I was softening but because I wanted to end this in a way that did not make me into the villain she could blame at church for the next decade. And when she whispered that she did not know how to live with him when he was like this, I said as gently as I could that I could not teach a man to be grateful and that I would not model quiet suffering anymore, and that if she ever decided to choose herself I would help with that. But that choosing him against me was a decision she had rehearsed for years, and I would no longer negotiate with it. My father asked one last time if I understood the gravity of what I had done, and I said I did, and that was why I had done it cleanly, legally, and with documentation, and that the only gravity I cared about now was the weight lifting off my chest as I stepped outside with a plan that did not include bailing anyone out. I drove to the rental without turning on music, signed in with the code the host had sent me, opened my laptop, and paid for the first term of my certification in full. Not because I needed a victory lap, but because I wanted a concrete act that translated the money I used to spend on their emergencies into an investment that belonged to me. And as the confirmation email arrived, I scheduled a final message to myself for the end of spring that simply said check in on your piece and do not explain it, because the habit of explaining is how I lost years to people who liked the sound of my apologies more than the feel of my boundaries. The house I left behind will either stand or it will learn, and either outcome is no longer my problem. And while there will be holidays where the stories about me are told with the usual spin and the usual smirks, there will also be a line they cannot cross because the bank, the utility companies, and the law now repeat the boundary I finally spoke, and that is the ending I wanted, not a grand speech or a cinematic door slam, but a clean transfer of power backed by paper. And if anyone asks whether I went too far, I will say I went exactly as far as necessary to stop being the burden they invented and to become the woman who wrote her own terms and kept them.